Thanks so much for joining us today. It is early February. It seems like the legislature has taken a long time to really rev up and get going this year. Is my perception wrong, or what are you noticing?
Well, I think your perception is pretty accurate. I've been asked that question a lot. It doesn't seem like we have many bills this year, not a lot on either second or third reading so far. And so I just did a little quick research, and historically, since I've been in the Senate, I didn't keep track before that, but it's always been a topic of my interest. How many bills have been introduced by the introduction deadline? Now, we do introduce bills after that through special privileged committees, but by the introduction deadline. And we're down about between almost 30% in the Senate and about 20% in the House from the historical averages of how many bills have been introduced. And so that perception, I think, is correct. It's been attributed to both a lot of new legislators and a new governor. When you know where the governor's at, then maybe you're at least when you're of the same party, you might be a little more aggressive in doing legislation. And I think there's a little patience to see maybe what he wants to do.
From your perspective, how's that relationship working out so far? You have a new governor, and while he's not new to the Senate, he is in a new position. You also have a number of new lawmakers. Do you feel like these two bodies are still trying to figure out that dynamic?
I do. I think it's probably, I'm not part of the House, but I think it's a little harder in the House because they have a lot of new members. We have 6, but of those 6, 2 were in the House for 4 years. So we really only have 4 new members in the Senate. So that dynamic is less. Working with a new governor has been very good, I think, because, in my opinion, maybe because he spent so long in the Senate, he's pretty interested in learning what topics are of interest to us and not just driving his own agenda.
Now, there are a number of issues, even though it's less than average for most years, there are still a number of issues on your plate as a member of the Senate and the State Affairs Committee. On Friday, there was an interesting discussion and a vote on Marsy's Law, which would add victims' rights to Idaho's Constitution. On the Senate panel, you were the only one to vote against sending that bill to the floor. And it was interesting. I noticed a lot of the senators had reservations about Marsy's Law and this proposal, but they talked themselves into it. You said that you previously supported this effort and talked yourself out of it. Can you explain why that is?
Well, I spent a lot more time researching it. And of course, then we've had more data from other states since our initial vote to look at and to see how it's impacted things. But the primary thing that was of importance to me was that we don't, in many, and I would say most cases, we don't specify the details of a right in the Constitution. We say you have these rights, and then those rights are typically enumerated or detailed more in code. And that was the hurdle that I don't think I gave it proper consideration. I'm a huge supporter of victims' rights. I have family members and friends, as I'm sure we all do, who have been victims of crime. And so it's not that I don't support victims' rights. It's just I think there's an appropriate place to address those. And some of the concerns that were brought up I agree with. So we put this in the Constitution, and it becomes expensive or cumbersome to do, then we have to amend the Constitution, which is more difficult, obviously, than changing a state law. So do we do that? And as I explained, I couldn't quite get over that hurdle today, and I'm still gathering information, but as of today, I couldn't get there to vote for it.
You brought up an interesting point in committee that you looked at it through the lens of gun rights, that the line guaranteeing Second Amendment, or gun rights basically in Idaho's Constitution, is very, very short, and everything else is dealt with in statute. And you drew some parallels between what you saw as victims' rights in the statute and gun rights in statute.
Yes. The right to keep and bear arms, I think it's Article 1, Section 18 of the Idaho Constitution, is longer than the Second Amendment, which more people are familiar with, but it's still not very long. It does detail that we can pass laws regarding concealed weapons and a couple other things, but it's still pretty short, and it just gives general parameters. And I have worked on concealed carry laws, stand your ground, castle doctrine, carrying on college campuses. I have worked on all of those issues, but we've always worked to change the law because our rights were protected by the Constitution. How those rights were, the details of how those rights were protected were always done in statute. And it just seems to me that in the case of victims' rights, we have a constitutional provision that says they have those rights, and working out the details of those rights could be done in code.
Well, that's certainly an interesting issue that we will keep following. I wanted to move on to a proposal that is in the House right now, but if it passes, the full body will likely end up in Senate State Affairs. And it is a proposal that would change the way the legislature deals with administrative rules. Currently, the different agencies propose rule changes, IDAPA rule changes, and they stay in place unless both bodies vote them down. This proposal would require a more active role for the legislature, that both bodies would have to affirmatively agree, so both bodies would have to vote for them. Where are you on this proposal?
Well, I think the principle of having both bodies approve of a rule is good. Historically, I think Nebraska is the only state that has a unicameral legislature. So the national level and the state level, all laws, except for Nebraska, have to be passed by both bodies of the legislature. In many cases, a rule has the effect of law. It has penalties that go with it. And so I think the idea that both bodies should approve it has merit. It can be, I suppose it could be more cumbersome, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And so I think in general, as I mentioned, I've not seen the legislation, but in general, I think the principle is sound that both bodies should have to approve a rule.
Another issue that is in front of the House is redistricting. That would add another member of the majority party to the redistricting commission. On Friday morning, House Democrats walked out of the House State Affairs Committee in protest because they felt like there wasn't enough notice given to the public on what would be a constitutional change. Where are you on this, and do you feel like there should be more public input on something that could have big consequences for Idaho citizens and how they're represented?
Well, it's my understanding of the legislation that the additional member is chosen by a vote of the statewide elected officials.
Oh, okay, got it.
And so if that's correct, and then that's probably, I would think that would be a good thing to do. The issue you have is they have an equal number they have 6 members, so they can have a lot of tie votes. The redistricting cases, regardless of the past, just about always go to court. I think that having an additional member so they could move through the process quicker. We're going to get a court to weigh in on it anyway. And then I think that having the statewide elected officials who don't have a vested interest in how the districting turns out appoint someone gives them an independent lens to look at the issue through.
But arguably, the statewide officials would have a vested interest in how that redistricting commission shakes out, how those redistricted legislative districts look and congressional districts look, especially if they are all of one party.
Yeah, and I guess that's where if you want to change that, then get more statewide elected officials elected of your party if you want to have a say in that process.
Another big issue that is going to be in front of the legislature that we haven't seen an actual bill on is the public school funding formula. There have been draft pieces of legislation that have been floated around. Are you thinking that we are going to see this resolved by the end of the legislative session?
Well, it is a big issue because that's where over half the state budget goes to the public schools. And so it's a very big issue. And there's issues, some schools get more, some schools get less. I think that they started out by having the public hearing. I think that's a good way to get input and actually see the product. And it's my understanding, and again, I don't really work on education issues much, that even if we pass the bill, it would not go into an effect for another year. At least that's my understanding of the intent. Whether we can get that done this session or not, I don't know, but I do know that we would like to make some changes, and we would like, personally, I shouldn't say we, I would like to make some changes. The school funding formula is quite old, and I do think it needs to be updated. Whether this is the best way to do it or not, I don't know.
What are you hearing from your caucus?
What I told you, that if part of my caucus comes from a district that is not going to have as much money, they don't like it.
Sure.
And if it's from a district that is doing well, then it's okay. That's kind of the sentiment at this point.
The funding formula, of course, doles out the money that is put into public education, but that, of course, depends on how much revenue we're looking at. This year, there have been a lot of questions as to how much revenue we're going to have for the next fiscal year because of the way tax returns are shaking out. What are you seeing? Can you give us an update on how revenues are looking?
Well, we saw again, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, that revenues are down. The tax commission is still convinced that, I don't know if it's a tax commission, but the people who give us the numbers are still convinced it's a withholding issue. It's not that income taxes are going to stay as low as they are. People didn't change their withholding forms, and as much as both the federal and the state law changed, they needed to. And their withholding went down, so they weren't paying as much tax, and probably most of us like that. And they heard their taxes were cut, so they didn't think about it. Now maybe they went down $80 a pay period and they should have only gone down $60. And so there will be a little bit of pain, I think, on the day you pay your taxes, but most of the experts seem to think that the revenue will be made up. But I have to rely on their opinion. I don't know.
I am certainly one of those people who will be feeling that pain. We're still a ways out from the likely end of the legislative session, but from where you're sitting now, how do we judge success? What, in your opinion, absolutely has to get done besides setting the budget before you go back home to Northern Idaho?
Well, I think that the one thing that was brought on by the initiative was Medicaid expansion, and exactly how that is dealt with is probably the issue. We talked about school funding. The funding formula doesn't have to pass. It is a big issue, but it doesn't have to pass. Medicaid expansion and whether or how it's funded will need to be, I think, is a big issue that has to be addressed before
You said whether it will be funded. Is that a risk that the legislature just isn't going to fund expansion?
I think it's a risk. I don't think it's a very high risk, but there is certainly some organized opposition that I hear in the halls to funding it, because there are some people who are pretty strongly opposed to it, and they think that that's our chance to, the legislature's chance to stop it. But I think that's a low risk. But that rumor is out there.
Other than the Idaho Freedom Foundation, where is that organized effort coming from?
Well, just individual legislators. That's where I've heard about it from.
Are you in that group?
I am part of the team that looks for solutions.
So, what would that team? What is your team looking for solutions propose?
Well, I'm mostly just talking about being part of leadership, and that. I don't really, I have a lot of personal things that I believe in pretty strongly, but I also believe that in most cases I express that through my vote, not through organizing different things, things to happen outside of what our Senate caucus decides. So my role is I see my role is to try to bring all the different people together and get them to talk to each other, so that particularly as a Republican caucus, we can be unified.
What are the chances, do you think, that the Senate Republican caucus will support Medicaid expansion without any sideboards, that it will fund it and that's it?
I think most of the senators think there should be some sideboards. That's what I've heard, is that, you know, I can only think of one Republican senator who has said he doesn't want any sideboards.
Okay.
So I think the chances that some sideboards will pass out of the Senate are pretty good.
Will the Senate support funding Medicaid expansion, though, if sideboards don't get out of the House?
Well, I think we could start some sideboards in the Senate, actually, and I think that my perception is that there'll be some sideboard. If you want my prediction, there'll be some sideboards and the funding will pass.
All right, Senator Steve Vick, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.